at players in 2021. Hello, it's Steve Van Tassel here with another edition of looking at your Dynasty Owner 2021 startup drafts. And this week, after last week when we looked at players whose performance increased during the second half of the season, the logical place to go for this week is to look at players who faded in the second half of 2020. So this week, we're going to look at people who performance went down in the second half of 2020 and how that should impact you, what you think about drafting them in your 2021 Dynasty Owner startups. The first thing we usually do is we usually look back at 2019 to see how that affected 2020. And in 2019, we had a couple of quarterbacks who are very similar in certain regards, but had ended up having different results, and both faded in the end of 2019, but ended up having different results in 2020. We have a tale of two quarterbacks, and those quarterbacks are Aaron Rodgers and Matt Ryan. And as I said, both of them have lots of similarities. They're both former first-round draft picks. They're both very highly paid veterans. Rodgers has one more Super Bowl ring than Ryan, and also one more MVP. But when we look at their performances at the end of the 2019 season, we see that both of them kind of faded in terms of their performance. For the full season, they were about even. Rodgers had 23.3 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game, and Ryan had 23.7. But both of them started off hot with about 28 points per game for Rodgers in the first half of the year and 26.7 for Ryan, and went down in the second half of 2019. Rodgers only averaged 18.4 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game, and Ryan averaged just 21. So what ended up happening in 2020 was they were drafted about the same position. Rodgers was drafted a little higher than Ryan, but not much, like about a round or so on average. But what ended up happening in 2020, as we all know, is they had wildly different results. Rodgers was the MVP. I mean, he had the best season. He was the number one quarterback, the number one overall player in Dynasty Owner. Whereas Ryan, he was about nine points. He averaged about 9 points less per game than Rodgers. He had 32.4 points versus 23.2 for Ryan. So, two players, similar results in 2019, but wildly different results in 2020. So you've got to think about the people who faded at the end of 2020 season and wonder, what are you going to do with them in terms of 2021 drafts? Do you take a chance on them like some of you did on Rodgers, or are you going to hold back and wait and not draft them with the worry that you'll get like a Matt Ryan again? So who were some of the players who faded in the second half of 2020? Well, what we're going to do is we're going to look at 5 players, one from each position, as we did in our previous look, and find out, who are any of them going to be the 2021 Aaron Rodgers? Who's going to do well? Who should you be targeting in your drafts? Who should you be fading? Very interesting, all these players. And the first player is probably the player who's most likely to possibly be the Aaron Rodgers of 2021, and that's quarterback Russell Wilson of the Seattle Seahawks. You see the hashtags if you follow things on Twitter, let Russ cook. And he did. He cooked in the first half of the season. He was the number one overall player in Dynasty Owner. He averaged 38.7 points per game in the first half, and he was very consistent. He pretty much was getting you 30 points or more per game. I mean, twice he had less than 30 points, but his worst week in the first half was 27 points. But that came in week 9, which was the last week of his first half because he had a bye. And then in week 10, he faced the Los Angeles Rams, and the Rams held him down and held Seattle down. And Wilson scored just 9.4 Dynasty Owner fantasy points in that game. And that set off a second half where the Seattle offense sputtered. And Wilson's performances went down. I mean, he went from averaging 38.7 points per game in the first half to averaging 20.4 points per game in the second half. And that was the case for the whole Seattle offense. They went from averaging 34 points a game in the first half of the season down to down to about 20 points per game in the second half of the season. As a result, Seattle fired their offensive coordinator. And so the question is, which Russell Wilson are you going to get in 2021? Are you going to get the first half MVP, the guy who averaged 38 points per game, or are you going to get the second half guy who averaged 20 points per game? Your decision on that is going to be key because with his $35 million contract, he's very expensive. He's not going to be the most expensive quarterback this year as he was last year, but he's going to be he's in the top 3 right now, and he's probably going to be in the top 5 by the time the season rolls around. So is he going to be Aaron Rodgers or is he going to be Matt Ryan next year? That's your decision. The second player we're going to look at is running back Ezekiel Elliott of the Dallas Cowboys. Now, I mean, you can't do first half, second half for Ezekiel Elliott. You can, but the differences aren't that dramatic. Really what the season went down to for Ezekiel Elliott was 5 games with Dak Prescott and the rest of the season without Dak Prescott. In the first 5 games with Dak Prescott, he was great. 21.7 points per game. And in the 10 games he played without Dak Prescott, with that quartet or however many other quarterbacks Dallas played, he averaged 11.3 dynasty owner fantasy points per game. So the drop in production was 10 points a game without Dak. But interestingly, it wasn't an across-the-board drop for everyone. His backup, Tony Pollard, actually played better without Prescott. And Pollard he averaged 6 points per game in those 5 games without Dak, but he averaged 7.8 points per game in the 10 games without Dak Prescott at quarterback. I'm taking out the big game that he had when Elliott didn't play in those numbers to show that he's even with Elliott playing and Dak not playing, Pollard moved up. So at $15 million a season, you have to wonder, how is Elliott going to perform in 2021? I mean, in 2020, he was one of the first running backs off the board. In the average in the first round, his ADP was 9.7. Is he going to be, when Dak comes back, is he going to be the same running back who was for the first 5 games of the season? Or is he going to be the running back how he performed at the end of the season? It'll be very interesting to see where he goes in these drafts, what you think is going to happen, and which Ezekiel Elliott's going to show up in 2021. The third player we're going to look at is a wide receiver, and it's another Seattle player, and it's Tyler Lockett. The Seattle offense went down in the second half, and it affected all the players. It affected Lockett. It affected DK Metcalf. But in terms of thinking about 2021, Metcalf's a special case. I mean, his salary is so low, $1.15 million a year, that he's probably going to still be taken very highly in dynasty owner drafts because of that low salary. But Lockett's a different case. His salary is $10.25 million. And so he's the guy who you're probably going to think twice about drafting in 2021. If you look at all the metrics from the season, from 2019 to 2020, Lockett his performance actually went up for the whole season. I mean, in 2019, he had 241.5 dynasty owner fantasy points, whereas in 2020, he had 270.6 dynasty owner fantasy points. So in theory, his ADP last year was 88.8. So in theory, he should probably be drafted earlier in 2021 based on those metrics. However, when you look at his halves of the season, you can see that he started off the season with 20.3 dynasty owner fantasy points in the first half of the season, and that fell to 13.5 in the second half of the season. So it'll be interesting to see whether dynasty owners look at Lockett's whole season, or whether they just look at the second half in terms of grading him and rating him for where they're going to draft him in 2021. Next, we're going to look at tight end, and our tight end is Jonnu Smith of the Tennessee Titans. Now, Smith is the different case here from the rest of the guys we're going to look at, in that he's a free agent. He doesn't have a big contract right now. He's going to get a bigger contract in 2021 and likely move teams. The rest of these guys are probably staying with their current team. There's none likely to be movement amongst Lockett, Wilson, or Elliott. But Smith is different. He sort of started off hot at the beginning of the season. I mean, in the first 4 games of the season, he averaged 17.5 dynasty owner fantasy points per game. And for the whole first half of the season, he averaged 11.3. But then he went down in the second half. He had a game where he put up 0 points. He had a high game of just 12 points, dynasty owner fantasy points in the second half of the season, and an average of 7.1. So for the whole season, he ended up being at the 15th ranked tight end. But that was lower than projected. He was drafted as like the number 11th tight end overall. So the question for dynasty owners is going to be based on what he gets for a salary next year is he going to be worth that salary, worth drafting or not? He's the only one here who I think probably might go undrafted in some dynasty owner leagues. I think pretty much you're going to have Wilson, Elliott, and Lockett all be drafted almost universally. It's just a question of where. But Smith could be an interesting case. He could be similar to Austin Hooper last year in that he may not get drafted. He may be too expensive to be drafted by some folks. And finally, we're going to look at everybody's favorite position. We all love him. It's kicker. And the kicker we've got here is Will Lutz of the New Orleans Saints. Lutz had a steep decline in his performance between the first half and the second half of the 2020 season. After the first 8 games, he was the number 3 overall kicker in Dynasty Owner. He was averaging 9.3 points a game, only behind Jason Sanders and Justin Tucker. And that changed in the second half of the season. I mean, the Saints offense kind of sputtered a little bit, and Lutz kind of missed a few more kicks in the second half than in the first half. In the first half, he missed 1 kick. In the second half, he missed 5 kicks, and he ended up averaging just 5 Dynasty Owner fantasy points per game in the second half of the season. Now, part of that is because of the injury to Drew Brees, and in those games, he averaged 2.75 points per game. But his average was still lower in the second half. Even without those games, he only averaged 7.25 points per game. So with Brees very likely to be retiring in 2021, what's the future of the Saints offense? Is it going to be as high-powered as it was in the past? And what does that mean for Lutz in terms of his opportunities? He makes $4 million. He makes a little over $4 million a year. So he's not the highest paid kicker, but he's very high up there. If you listen to me often enough, you read my articles often enough, you know that I don't really want to pay a lot for a kicker. So I would not want to have Lutz on my team with the potential of having a depressed Saints offense that he's kicking for at $4 million a year. I'd rather take a kicker earlier and let others scramble for their kicker at the end and overpay. But it'll be interesting to see what people think about Lutz. I mean, $4 million is a lot for a kicker, especially for a kicker whose performance went down in the second half and whose team might be dramatically different at this point next year. So that's it. Those are my 5 players. Those are all guys who faded in the second half of 2020. So tell me what you think. Did I miss somebody? Do you disagree with some of these people? I know statistically they faded, but do you think that that's not representative of what they're going to do in 2021? Drop me a tweet at SteveVT33 on Twitter, or post a comment on the YouTube page. Let me know what you think, where you're going to draft these guys, if you think they're going to be better or worse than they were in 2020. And don't forget to follow the articles and videos for all the rest of our Dynasty Owner team. We've got Nate Christian on Mondays doing his prospect preview. We've got Matt the Jerk, who's back for another year and does a deep dive into contracts per team on Wednesdays. Jay Pounds is talking about how to rebuild your Dynasty Owner team if you need to do that for 2021. And I'm here on Fridays, usually when I get the video up, looking at your startup draft for 2021. Follow all of us and Dynasty_Owner on Twitter. And thanks a lot. Hope you enjoyed the video, and good luck with your 2020 startup draft.